Nice to be here. Thank you for having me.
Well, first off, I know that we've had a number of conversations like in the past, and like I'm always learning so much more, especially about like the field of like esports. So like I'm like super pumped for our conversation today, obviously. But to kick us off, would love just to hear like talk about your current role. How did you get there? Talk to us about your path in sports. Would love to kick it off.
Yeah, absolutely. So, it's been about 17 years now in the sports and live entertainment industry. Started out with some phenomenal internships with Walt Disney World Company and then in minor league baseball. And quite frankly, I always say I attribute what I know and understood the path I wanted to take because of those two internships and what they taught me from that standpoint. But always knew I wanted to be in a creative um, partnership brand development type of role. I didn't realize it was going to be sales, if you will. But it's just, it's been a really amazing, fun ride to be able to have had the opportunity to work in the likes of motorsports to the theme park industry. And most recently, prior to Complexity with Feld Entertainment, live entertainment company that had both the live productions like Disney on Ice to the motorsports properties such as Monster Jam and Supercross. So from there, the doors continue to open, right? We all can determine our path, but sometimes there's paths that are brought to us that are unexpected. And esports was definitely something I always had my eye on, if you will, and kept a pulse check because there's always been crossover just from the traditional sports side and the live entertainment developments, and had this opportunity to join Complexity. And all I can say, it's been a wild ride since day one.
I bet. I mean, the whole world of like esports is just like super fascinating in general, and one that I've also tried to keep tabs on over the last couple of years. But like, what like, any shock when you went over to like the esports realm? Like, what surprised you the most? Like, how is it a totally different world as it relates to like sponsorships, or is it all relatively the same at the end of the day?
Yeah, I think it depends on who you ask, right? In what capacity that individual is within the esports and gaming world. For my instance, I'm with a team, and at Complexity, we're actually one of the longest standing esports organizations in North America. Jason Lake, our CEO, founded it back in 2003. So a long time around the block from that standpoint. So he's definitely seen it all as far as the evolution of it. And then in 2017, we were acquired by Jerry Jones of the Dallas Cowboys organization and the Goff family. So we were able to create this new brand identity, under that umbrella with the Cowboys. So those similarities for me coming from traditional sports and having, a traditional sports team in your family, if you will, definitely has had some points of connectivity
Sure.
as I got in there and understood, how can we continue to grow? How can we continue to set ourselves apart? But there's a lot of untapped territory, I guess would be the best way to put it, within esports and gaming. And I think that's where the intrigue is for brands. I think that's where a lot of excitement lies, but I think there's a long ways to go for us and for a lot of different aspects when it comes to esports and gaming as well, to really have similarities, if you will, from traditional sports sponsorships or how teams run, etc. But I don't think esports and gaming are trying to be like that, right? They're trying to be different and trying to bring something new from that standpoint.
Makes total sense. I mean, I think the thing that amazes me is like, esports has been on my radar for probably the last decade. And you were certainly ahead of the curve to be tracking it and keeping your eye on it before that. But like, as you had mentioned, Complexity being founded in like 2003, like that's nearly 2 decades ago at this point. So, like, has partnerships and sponsorships, has that always been part of the equation, or is that more of an area that is really come more to light in the last 10 years? Like, I'm just trying to think from like a business perspective, like where that revenue model is. Like, has it always been the partnership side, or is it or is that more recent?
I think that's definitely more recent.
Hmm.
So, sponsorships and that brand money, you have to have that unless you're really fortunate to have incredibly deep pockets, where you don't have to worry about that, and you've grandfathered in a couple of partners. But the sponsorship revenue is definitely takes up a much more greater portion of what we need to focus on when it comes to those revenue generating things versus in the past. I also think the difference is as well, in the past, you could go and get, someone to sponsor, let's just say one talent, and flip them a few bucks and give them, some, a swag or what have you and call it a day. But as esports and gaming has continued to evolve, those are the points of similarity, that they're trying to have those big dollar deals like you see in traditional sports. And you're starting to see that. I definitely think that there's still a lot of, not intimidation, but hesitation from a lot of the non-endemic brands as they continue to evaluate esports and gaming. I feel like too, this year in 2020 has taken on a new life for esports and gaming for those non-endemic partners, sure, especially for how they're choosing to spend. From my perspective. But yeah, I mean, it's partnerships and sponsorships are definitely a much bigger deal now than probably what they were 20 years ago. That's for sure.
Well, so you bring up, well, yes, but you bring up an interesting point where it's like maybe hesitation is the best word to describe like partners being involved in esports. But why is that? Because I would imagine that, with it being a very digital presence, you can track a lot of these major engagements, how many people are watching, how many people are engaging. You can measure things like lift, which I think is pretty traditional through sponsorships in general. So is that hesitation because there's just not enough data to support it? Or is it just the typical hesitation that you would get with anything new, where someone says, well, I don't know if I want to be a first mover and take a gamble or a risk on something that I don't know will pay off?
So I get the best way to answer this. So obviously my entire job is having these types of conversations, right? It's constant exploratory conversations with these brands. And I would say the majority of the conversations I have consist first and foremost of an education of esports and gaming, and not getting into granular. Most of these brands, they don't need to know what everything on a keyboard or a console, does, sure, from that standpoint. Sure. It's just trying to grasp and understand, the landscape of it. And then from there, taking them into the world of complexity and allowing them to start digesting, okay, this is what this could mean for your brand to come to life in a multitude of ways. And I think that's maybe the hesitation with a lot of these brands. And I applaud them for taking time and maybe doing that crawl, walk, run approach with how they're going into the space. Because there's so many different diverse ways to integrate yourself into this space. There's a ton of data out there. I think there's been a lot of data used maybe not correctly. And I think you see like folks like YouGov that have brought on reputable individuals like Nicole Pike that have come in, to the mix. And you see a lot of these agencies, et cetera, that are diving in, because we all know brands make decisions to justify spends off of data. And I think it's wonderful to see all the new data that's being presented. So you can start telling a much more deeper, authentic story that, there's going to be $2 billion spend in esports. And it's like generic data. But it's like, what's the granular data for complexity for this particular audience? And I think that's what brands are wanting to understand deeper, so that when they do make that entry point, they know that they're not just this outside brand coming into this very tight-knit community, and they know they're coming into this space in a very true way from that standpoint. So, all I'll say lastly is there's one really key buzzword that flies around esports and gaming, and that's authenticity. And I say that laughingly because it's used all the time, but there's no joke around that. Like, if you're not authentic coming into the esports and gaming community space, you will get called out in a second by the community. And I applaud that.
Now I want to ask, I was like, oh, well, what leagues and organizations aren't authentic? But that would be a question for another time. So, I think, at least in my time, working in sports a number of years ago, one of the things that we also talked about, other than being like genuine and authentic, was how do we position ourselves differently? How are we unique? So curious, as it relates to the esports landscape, what are the unique value propositions that that you put forth when you're pitching a new brand, when the spend that a brand is potentially going to make is potentially in traditional sport, the NFL, the MLB. So like what is that value prop that you're seeing a lot of organizations use to try to attract some of those dollars?
Well, selfishly, I'm going to talk about our organization.
Go for it.
Complexity from that standpoint, and those are the things that we're really proud of. Are those points of differentiation? We may not have hundreds of millions, of followers, but we have really amazing, focused, dialed in followers. We have 10 plus million followers, for complexity. But what does that mean from that standpoint when you start talking to brands? So one thing that Jason Lake and our organization started talking about a couple years ago was this esports. What's the esports 2.0 landscape? What does that mean? And for complexity and for our team, what that meant for us, and it's in our mantra, is putting players first and players always first from that standpoint. So they are always the first and foremost of how we evaluate or go about doing anything, because at the end of the day, they're the blood and the lifeline of the organization. So then what do we do to honor that? So we make sure that each of our players have their own luxury housing, right? So they don't get all put into one location. So they each have their own space from that piece. And I think that's really important, especially in that typical demographic that are gamers, to have their own space, but still be close enough to their team members to be able to come together. From the health and wellness standpoint, this is huge for us. And this was able to be heightened with our relationship with the Dallas Cowboys when we had that acquisition in 2017. So they have access to go eat where the Cowboys eat. So they have well-balanced meals in front of them from that standpoint. They get to train at Dallas Fit there at the Cowboys headquarters. So they have these amazing facilities for them to be able to have that health and wellness aspect. And then on top of that, one of our biggest points of differentiation before anybody else there in North America really was our headquarters that we opened up. And what our headquarters brought within those walls. And this was state-of-the-art, world-class aspects that were brought forth for our players to come in and train the way they need to be trained, be able to step away from that training and be able to get that health and wellness piece. But just real quick thing, in our headquarters, our players, when they're able to access in there, we actually set up everything as if they were going into competition. So even details like when you have to step up on the podium to enter into the space where you sit down to compete, just so they're like that mindset starts. We can control lights, we can control sound, the temperature, the smell, like everything that goes on.
Recreate the environment.
It's
right.
Pretty cool from that bit. So yeah, so those are definitely points of differentiation. And then really the continuation of the innovation that we are bringing forth through complexity, utilizing our players to find those developmental aspects. And a big part of that is our partnership with We Are Nations, our apparel company. And we've just started to scratch the surface with them, launching that this year. And a lot of exciting things that are coming down the pipeline with those guys.
Yeah, and I imagine it's all cyclical too, right? That if you're creating this incredible experience for players, you're more attractive that players want to come to, so you have better talent, better performance as a result. And then it's all the opportunities I imagine to sponsor have sponsorship in sort of behind the scenes and how that works, and it just seems like a lot of integrations there. Speaking of wellness, though, and I think one of the questions I asked you before we connected today was, COVID and everything that's going on in the pandemic. I'm just sort of curious to understand, how has that impacted either your organization? How have you guys responded to that, or alternatively from the industry at large? I imagine this has pardon my pun, changed the game in a lot of different ways. Sorry, that's just who I am. But I imagine that's changed the game in a lot of ways.
Yeah, I mean, crazy enough for, myself, I started in esports this year. So for
Yeah,
me coming
great
in,
environment to come into.
yeah, like let's just say 2020 has been interesting, super fortunate obviously to come into this space and to learn, what I've been able to learn. But yeah, I have to say I know nothing different but esports and gaming within this environment. But what I saw our organization do to ensure that we kept the health and wellness and safety of our players and even our staff a priority is amazing, from that piece. But it definitely has taken an effect on the players, and the limitations of being able to access headquarters, the limitations of not having live tournaments, and these teams like our Counter-Strike team that are used to thriving off of that live audience, right? I mean, that's where, like, you think about yourself being an athlete in whatever capacity. I mean, that's what gets your blood going and the adrenaline, and these guys, all of a sudden, it's like, boom, just kidding, no more live
Yeah.
audiences. You're sitting in a hotel room or a room, by yourself, and your buddy's like 3 doors down, and you're not like next to each other. So there was a mental shift, everything from that strategy shift. But we try to provide everything possible for these guys to and girls to adapt as needed, from that standpoint. But yeah, it's definitely different. But I also think there's been some interesting learnings that have come out of it, of where a team like Complexity, as a result of COVID, yes, there's been these changes our players and our talent have had to endure, but we've also found some fantastic new opportunities that we might not have potentially explored beforehand. And we've started doing a lot more tournaments. We did a partnership with PlayStation, that they were doing, that we were able to partner up. We were able to take our Army partnership, where typically it's a live in-person event activation, and flip that into a 48-week online tournament for soldiers to participate in. And we have our Race to World First event that's going to be taking place here soon. And we just find ourselves really getting into this tournament business, if you will. So it's kind of been an interesting dynamic, all things considered, of 2020.
So does that tournament, does that stay, if and when, knock on wood, when, pandemic is over and hopefully things start to normalize a little bit in the surrounding environment? Like, so has this just become like a whole new opportunity and revenue stream for teams and organizations moving forward? Or is this really just going to be something that we see, is popular during times like this?
No, I definitely think it's going to be something that stays. I think more teams and more organizations is, people are still craving that live aspect of esports and attending the live events from that bit. But I think what it's doing is giving even more access and more frequency for the community to see gaming taking place with these various tournaments. I know you and I had spoke, Nerd Street Gamers, for example. I think that organization is phenomenal, and what those guys continue to do in the tournaments that they produce. And I think you're going to start seeing, teams start to kind of bring those kind of opportunities in-house and figuring it out themselves. Complexity already has produced our own last year, before all this Race to World First, like I had mentioned before. And we're doing that again this year, and we host that, we broadcast that, but that's teams that come in from all over the place. Obviously they're not all going to physically be in the same place, but I think you're just going to see tournaments such as that start to take a life of its own on top of everything else.
Cool. Well, that's great to hear, right? It's like, it always amazes me that, like, when something, even when unfortunate things like a pandemic hits, it's always interesting to see how organizations and opportunities, essentially come out of the woodwork that you never would have thought of otherwise. So
Yeah.
Glad to hear that at least it's evolving and creating new opportunities in some respect. We've also, previous to this conversation, we've talked about the interesting things that are going on with like lag time, and like, now that there's, people are in separate areas, like how do you start to traverse that? I'm curious more on the business end, what in general, whether or not it's in like a COVID-19 world or outside of it, what are some of the just general challenges that you run into with like sponsorship and data, right? Whether or not it's prospecting, or whether or not it's actually internal challenges that you might have after you have a partnership. I just love to learn a little bit about what you guys run into.
Yeah, so I think it's what I love about what we do, and I think it doesn't matter like who it is, right? Everybody has the opportunity to customize what you do, right? If you're operating off of, hey, menu A, B, or C, sponsor, brand partner, pick that, that you wouldn't be successful. I think there's always going to be those foundational elements that brands are wanting to see within a deal. But during these times, and especially COVID definitely having an impact, whether it's on budgets being reimagined and shifting to that digital space, but then again, not okay, now we want to be within this gaming industry, but we don't really know what that means. So let's figure it out together. Again, I think there hasn't been so much challenges outside of maybe, budgets being cut back or people wanting to pause until let's see what happens after 2020. But I think it's, again, back to that comment I said earlier, it's the crawl, walk, run. Like, let us figure out what is the best entry point to come in, so we can start to understand what this means for us. Is it connectivity with a particular gaming title that relates best with our brand? Is it with just overall the mantra of complexity, trying to be an innovative esports team within the space? Or is it a particular streaming talent within our lifestyle brand that we want to build a program around? So, there's so many different ways to enter. I think that's something that I've really tried my best, is not to overwhelm someone in these conversations when they're trying to explore this space, and just get down very quickly to, okay, tell me what you think you want, and so then I can go back and come back and say, hey, these are a couple of things for you to consider to start moving forth from that piece. But I think for me then personally, when I got into this space, I just assumed, and maybe that was just shame on me, but I think it's just the perception of esports and gaming from coming from the outside. And you would see some of these big major brands, you'd think, okay, well, if you've got some of these big brands in it, then people should just be like all over this. This
Right.
shouldn't be like rocket science. And I mean, there's still a lot of conversations and work that have to go into it. And there's a lot of variables that play into it, just like with any traditional sports team out there vying for brands' dollars.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that's like the thing that I'm trying to figure out is like, how do you go about figuring that out? Like, because to your point, like there are so many different avenues to explore, to talk about with a partner. There's so many variables to factor in. So it's like, what are their goals? Who are they trying to get in front of? How does that match with what you're able to produce? It's just like, it seems like a lot, right? Especially in an industry that is still, has a huge area of opportunity, is still trying to define itself in the different opportunities that presents itself, versus like, MLB or an NFL team. Like, you have a pretty good idea of like what assets are available. So
Yep.
like, how the heck do you go about figuring out how to structure those things? Is it a case by case basis? It seems like it'd be a lot of manual work. So
first and foremost for me, when I came in, obviously there was a baptism by fire of understanding. Okay,
Sure.
I guess it's the best way to put it when you come into esports and gaming. But it's all right for complexity. Again, speaking specifically for this organization, it's who's your current partners, who have you tried to pitch, understanding like where are we going in the future, so then we can start determining what are those key categories that we really need to start fulfilling, right?
Yep.
So then myself working with our marketing team, and it's all hands on deck when you're on these teams, and especially when you have a organization like complexity. It's not like we have this massive front office. So it really is, everybody gets involved and is part of that conversation. And so there was a determination of, okay, these 30 plus categories we know are the key categories that we want to be in, and have a partnership alignment. And we think that we can tell a really good story on that. And granted, there's probably 10 of those categories that are like must-haves. Like, you really hope you have those categories as an esports team, and it's just sometimes they're not as easy to come about, but that you're fitting for that and fitting for those dollars and trying to justify a narrative. So really that's, where it's, how do you start figuring it out? To your question is, okay, what are our target categories? Now let's start figuring out from there, like how we can start putting a couple of thought starters against that within those categories to just start generating interest, for those folks from that piece. So I don't know. It's a really cool thing too that I've seen within esports and gaming is you've got so many of these startup companies that know that they can get a quick, massive reach because of the gaming community audience coming into this space versus having to spend, 7 figures plus, in traditional sports to have, naming rights, et cetera, and that I think there's a little bit more flexibility in a lot of these teams and organizations to entertain those types of smaller companies that may not have the big budgets, but know that, hey, they could be a long-term strategy for us. And they may come in at a smaller investment now, but we can grow together. We can create something together. We can develop in. And again, those are the things that I try to look for when we're trying to find those points of differentiation for, having complexity break through the clutter, if you will. Yep.
No, I think that's very well said. Maybe my last pair of questions for you, whether it's complexity or the industry at large, like where's the biggest opportunity in sponsorship in your eyes? Is it, well, I don't want to answer, but like where do teams have the most opportunity to improve?
That's a great question. Gosh, because there's so many different factors of what attracts the different brands and companies to the respective teams, right? And it could be talent, or it can be the gaming titles that they're competing in. It can be the fact that they have, really awesome headquarters, that you can bring events to life. I do think with what, you look at what Twitch has been doing in just the space of bringing in live entertainment when it comes to music and film, and having that start to merge itself within this world. You see like all these music licensing deals starting to happen, on the gaming publisher side. I think that's what you're going to start to see because there is going to be that crossover to mainstream in the hard gamers and the casual gamers. And there has to be that middle ground, for that continued growth. And I think where that middle ground exists to bring that all to life is that live entertainment space. And I don't know what that necessarily looks like. But it's definitely a space that obviously has already been shown success with, like I said, with what Twitch has done with integrating live music, prior to tournaments and having these virtual concerts. I think that's just going to continue from that standpoint. So, and I think it's finding those ways to humanize the talent in esports and gaming. You've got this select group of names that most people know that are in the community, and even from a casual, these big streamers, etc. But I think that's going to be something that we can start capitalizing on much better, is not only finding the talent that can actually compete in the game and be a winning team, but also bring other aspects to the table that you can monetize and really start to build a character and a life around an organization.
Yeah, and the humanization aspect of it is always a key to, I think, most organizations, right? Having the fans and the people that are watching feel that they actually know the key constituents and the players. So makes total sense. So I guess my last question to you really is, you've really set the bar high in a really exciting career, in a really exciting position to people that want to get into esports. So just like in general, like what advice might you offer to individuals, trying to break into esports or people that want to learn more about it?
That's a great question. You
can direct the answer at me. And
then
I can take it.
Definitely the last person that is going to be telling anybody this is what you need to do to get into esports. From that standpoint, I think for what I can share is, if you have a passion for sponsorship, for that, putting something together, that brand creativity, etc., and you're just starting out, internships. I know that seems so old school in a lot of capacities these days, but don't disregard that. And I know a lot of these teams and gaming organizations, I'm starting to see a lot more of these internship opportunities. And that is something that I would just absolutely push someone to go do, because you may think you want to pursue one channel within the gaming and esports industry and realize, you're actually really good at something else. But I think too, I'm one of a different, background, right? I have a diverse background. I didn't start in gaming. I didn't, live, breathe, and die esports and gaming. I didn't dream as a child to work in esports and gaming. It wasn't around in that capacity, when I was younger, and it's been the evolution of it. So I would say if you're in another industry, don't disregard that. It doesn't mean that you can't, cross over into that. You always can bring something from that outside into this industry, and vice versa from that, standpoint too. So I think it's just to stick the path and follow your dreams, and work hard at the end of the day, and try to build your network. I think that is the biggest thing for me, that I'm proud of, and I've worked really hard at that. Doesn't matter if you're just starting out or you've been in the game for a while. Like, creating a solid network of really great people within the community or outside of the community, at least do that, because those people will be with you forever. Those are the people that are going to call you and offer you opportunities to explore down the road for job opportunities as well. So I think that's, build your brand and build that true network that you can have with you for your entire career, both personally and professionally.
I think that's a very succinct and dead-on piece of advice. So I think that's a great way to end. I know that your schedule is like crazy busy, like all the time. So genuinely, like, thank you so much for taking the time to chat today. I always find this stuff incredibly interesting. And I also love the two of us going on tangents all the time. So it's super helpful. But yeah, just thank you again. Appreciate
Yeah,
the time.
Absolutely. Yeah. And one final plug just for a couple of folks, you've got to go check out Through the Smoke. So it's our content series that follows our Counter-Strike team, and it just to kind of piggyback off that humanizing bit, you see a lot of these content series that are coming out of these esports organizations. And I think it's amazing because it really truly does show that peek behind the curtain of what goes into it. And what these guys and girls endure, as they go about the training standpoint. So yeah, but check it out from a complexity standpoint. YouTube, Through the Smoke. When we just wrapped up our season finale for season 2, but it's a great piece to check out for complexity.
Look below for a link. So
we'll
throw that in there. Well, awesome. Well, thank you again. Certainly appreciate the time.
Yeah, thanks, Alex.